Okay, I'm going to be refuting the Bush-era tax cuts of 2001 and 2003, which included the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act and the Job Growth Tax Reconciliation Act. These two acts were set to expire in 2010, however, President Obama implemented a 2-year extension on them, and they're currently set to expire in January 1st, 2013. My first claim is that the main claim I'm going to respond to today is that Bush-era tax cuts have failed to decrease our national deficit, with secondary claims that 1, revenue has gone down after the passing of the Bush-era tax cuts. 2, the Bush-era tax cuts disproportionately affect working and middle-class taxpayers. And 3, the Bush-era tax cuts, if they were to expire, the economy will experience growth. So the first claim that revenue has gone down since passing the tax cuts points out that if tax cuts were to end, revenue would increase across the board for all incomes. However, that is merely a broad analysis of one possible outcome. But one thing is for certain. What will increase across the board is $423 billion in federal taxes that we would now be faced with. This would be the second largest tax increase historically, with the first one taking place 70 years ago in 1942. This means that according to the Tax Policy Center, 83% of households in the United States would have an average tax increase of $3,701. The Congressional Budget Office also reports that although the expiration of the tax cuts may cut the deficit over the next decade, it could lead to a reduction in economic growth and put us into a recession. Another point that is referenced by the advocate is that according to the Tax Policy Center, ending the tax cuts on the rich would extend revenue by $678 million through 2020. There is no dispute that the tax cuts on the rich would substantially impact top earners, but many of the individuals that are top earners are business owners. Thus, they are owners of S corporations, sole proprietorships, partnerships, and limited liability companies. They play a relative role in the job creation process. According to the Heritage Foundation, 20 million workers are employed by these businesses. The heavy tax increases that they will be burdened with will slow the hiring process once again and put more people out of work. The second supporting claim is that Bush-era tax cuts disproportionately affect the working and middle-class taxpayers, and further points out that the rich receive a disproportionate amount of the Bush tax cuts than compared to everyone else. These are both ambiguous comparisons. The label of working class and middle class is subjectively defined by individuals, academic class models, and government class models. According to an article in Real Clear Politics by Robert Samuelson, 9 out of 10 Americans locate themselves as somewhere in the middle class. Somewhere meaning that the middle class can encompass both lower and upper middle class subgroups. For example, in the Pew survey, 15% of Americans consider themselves in the upper middle class, 49% consider themselves in the middle class, and 25% consider themselves in the lower middle class. Interestingly enough, a definition offered by Business Dictionary actually considers lower middle class and the working class to be one and the same. The last supporting claim states that if the Bush-era tax cuts were to expire, the economy will experience growth. In addition, a supporting statement is offered that there is no evidence that tax increase will impact the labor force or cause people to work less. But this supporting claim is contradicting to the quote made by the advocate from the Congressional Budget Office article that states, "The weakening of the economy will lower taxable incomes and raise unemployment, generating a reduction in tax revenues and an increase in spending on such items such as unemployment insurance." This directly reveals the impact on the labor force, more unemployment. Furthermore, in the same article, it states that lifting the tax cuts without any similar restraints in the future along the way could cause a reduction in output and income in the long run. In conclusion, the claim that the Bush-era tax cuts failed to decrease our national deficit is correct at face value. However, the tax cuts of 2001 and 2003 were not initiated nor designed to decrease our national deficit. They were set in place to stimulate job creation and provide relief from our economy.
All right, the structural things are fine. At the beginning, you kind of do this whole review about what the tax cuts are. I guess that's to give it a context, which is understandable. That makes some sense. But it does take you a while to get to the advocate's actual claim. I think at the end of the argument, you have a good point that you're making, that the tax cuts were not really designed to address the issues of the deficit, but they were rather designed to affect stimulus and growth in the economy. And the question should be whether or not they've met that objective, and maybe if you talk about whether or not they contribute to the deficit, there would be a discussion of whether or not that economic activity had any impact on the deficit. I think that that's maybe the way to try and diminish that relationship. The signpost on the first point was very clear. There's not really a lot of discussion of what the advocate's argument was on this particular point, but you've got a lot of information suggesting why the tax cuts, allowing them to continue, would be problematic for the economy. Excuse me, not allowing them to expire would be problematic for the economy. The substantial tax increase that everybody would suffer from, the potential decline in growth, the fact that we're on the brink of a recession, that the amount of money, I think I heard you say that the rich would be affected by a $678 million by 2020. $678 million, nothing to sneeze at for you and me, but that's less than $1 billion, and the government spends that in a morning, so I'm not exactly sure that that is one of those things of critical importance. I do like the argument that says that it is really that these are job creators and that there would be a consequence to the job. Now, the advocate made an argument that said that there's no evidence that shows that it would have an impact. Your response should be, well, I've just provided you with 6 pieces of evidence that shows you that you would in fact get that consequence, and that, I don't know what the advocate's talking about on that particular point. On the second point, you spend all this time defining what the middle class is and whether or not people fall in the middle class. I don't know what that argument gets you. What am I supposed to do with that challenge? This is one of those places where you need to explain why your definitional issue is important to the context of the argument, and I don't think that you did that very effectively on that point. On the third point, or the last point, I think you had an interesting argument suggesting that the advocate's own evidence suggests that there would be these negative consequences, and I thought that you did a pretty good job turning that around. And then at the end, you kind of try to reclassify the way we ought to be looking at this argument. I still think that there might be some issues about deficit reduction that you could talk about in the relationship to the economy, but I thought that that was a good turn on that particular point. All right.